NFL talent is beyond rare. Only about 1 in every 4,315 high school football players make it to the pros. But it's not that simple. One must go through a rigorous 3 to 5 year process of weightlifting, eating, and physically maturing in college. This takes an 18-year-old boy and turns him into a 20-something-year-old man, at least physically. Now, what about those dudes who are just total freaks of nature in high school? When you look at a Nick Chubb or a Derrick Henry, you begin to wonder how they'd hold up in the NFL at 18. Too bad we'll never know, as the NFL doesn't allow anybody to play in the league unless they've been out of high school for 3 years. However, in 1954, Carlton Chester Gilchrist was a kid who, after his junior year in high school, left early to sign with the NFL's Cleveland Browns. This had never been done before or since. So what happened to this high school phenom? Well, let's find out.
He probably is the greatest football player that we've never heard of.
He was the biggest running back I've ever seen.
Cookie was besieged by devils, maybe some of his own making.
There's a Japanese expression, the nail that sticks out gets hammered.
In Brackenridge, Pennsylvania during the early 1950s, Cookie Gilchrist had become a local legend with his astonishing size.
He excelled so much so that he was actually playing on the varsity team when he was in junior high. That's how good he was. By the time he actually was in high school, he was pretty much a celebrity.
By the time he was a junior, Cookie was around 6'3" and well over 200 pounds. Combine that with exceptionally rare athleticism, and you have a once-in-a-generation type of talent. As a junior in high school, it was clear that Cookie was destined for a career in pro football. Cookie himself didn't like school all that much. When it wasn't football season, he often worked odd jobs for dollars here and there, instead of regularly attending school. And when it came to thoughts about college itself, Cookie didn't have the desire to pursue it, despite his talent. Although, he still had dreams of playing pro ball one day. You see, back in those days, it wasn't unheard of for a guy to go to work for a few years, then pursue this type of career, because pro sports weren't huge like they are today. In fact, many pro players worked regular jobs in the off-season. When the news of Cookie's lack of desire to go to college spread 2 hours north to Cleveland, the Browns' head coach, Paul Brown, devised a plan. Brown arranged a meeting to meet with Gilchrist, and this must have been done in some sort of secrecy because nobody in Gilchrist's life heard about this until later. With the promise of making the Browns roster while he was still in high school, Gilchrist was offered $5,500 to sign with Cleveland. Cookie was immediately enticed, not by the offer of playing pro football, but rather the immediate cash. Compared to the small amounts of money from the odd jobs he worked, this was a sizable amount. In his mind, this was just the start of a pro football career where he'd earn a lot more. So before telling anybody, even his parents, Gilchrist signed with the Cleveland Browns as a junior in high school. Now, it is worth noting that he was 18 at the time. Gilchrist did tell his family eventually, and they were okay with his pursuits. So, without finishing high school, he headed over to Cleveland during the training camp of 1954. However, there was one serious issue. When the NFL got word that the Browns had signed a high school kid who hadn't even graduated yet, not only did they tell the Browns that it was against their policy, but it was likely illegal. There was zero tolerance in regards to this situation, and Paul Brown was forced to release Gilchrist. For Cookie, this was a double whammy, because not only did Paul Brown break his promise with the young 18-year-old, this made Cookie blacklisted from the NFL and ineligible to play college football. So even though he didn't have the desire to initially go to college, now he literally couldn't go that route if he wanted to pursue football. From that moment on, Cookie began to have a major issue with authority, and it was all rooted from the misleadings by Paul Brown. Instead of going back to finish high school, Cookie headed north beyond the border. In 8 years across the border, the legend of Cookie Gilchrist spread. He had grown to an immense size.
He was back in those, he weighed about 260, I believe, was his playing weight in the AFL, and I think he was about 6'4".
With that size, Cookie played fullback, linebacker, kicker, he caught passes, and he was an excellent blocker. This man did everything, virtually playing almost every snap. By the end of 1961, Cookie had been named a divisional all-star 5 straight years, and was a Grey Cup champion. He had every accolade necessary to be a future Hall of Famer in the CFL. However, despite everything that happened on the field, Cookie's time spent in Canada wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Cookie was well known for being outspoken, loud, and unapologetic. This was due to being raised by his grandfather, who was a freed slave.
He was very much so influenced by his grandparents. I think they told him, being an African-American man growing up in the 1930s and 40s, that he really had to stand up for himself.
Due to his contrarian reputation, especially considering that he was a black man in the 1950s, Cookie was painted by the newspapers as a lazy sports star who couldn't get along with people. In Canada, Cookie was frequently fined and suspended for his defiance of team rules. On one memorable occasion, he attempted to engage his coach, Jim Trimble, in a fistfight. He was openly depicted by the future commissioner of the league as a, quote, dumb athlete. According to Cookie himself, quote, "I have all the clippings in a scrapbook, and if you read those stories, you wouldn't think I was worthy of the Hall of Fame." After the newspaper painted Cookie as the bad guy, Gilchrist sued the newspaper for defamation and received a settlement and apology in print. Considering the time period, it's extraordinary that Cookie was willing to stand up for himself. But ultimately, the way he was treated, along with the lack of good pay, led to Cookie leaving Canada. The two parties never saw eye to eye after the fact. They were white coaches and managers who had cut him, badmouthed him in the press, and undermined, in his eyes, his business and monetary success on and off the field. He refused to guarantee his cordiality with the league's boss, and is therefore the only player in CFL history to refuse a bust in the Hall of Fame. Cookie felt that turning down the Hall of Fame would draw more attention to how he was treated and do more for black athletes of future generations. Sadly, it's mostly forgotten. After leaving Canada, the Buffalo Bills of the newly formed American Football League reached out to Cookie. The NFL and AFL were the two main American football leagues in the States, and didn't merge fully until just before the 1970 season. So anyway, Cookie joined the Bills, and immediately was a game changer. In his first year, Gilchrist became the first AFL player to eclipse 1,000 rushing yards in a season, setting a then AFL record with 13 touchdowns, and also he won league MVP. The following year, he excelled once again. This included a jaw-dropping performance versus the Jets, where he rushed for 243 yards and 5 touchdowns. Throughout his time with the Bills, Cookie Gilchrist became a household name in Buffalo, and was one of, if not the best player in the league. Some refer to him as the Jim Brown of the AFL. But like in Canada, friction with team management overshadowed his on-field accomplishments during that time period.
I'd asked for a 4-year contract with the Buffalo Bills for $200,000, and Ralph Wilson had me arrested.
Oh, no.
Yeah. That's the time, remember the time they said that I had failed to stop at the stop sign, they had charged me with 7 felony counts that I assaulted a police officer.
These charges were later dropped. However, friction continued between the Bills and Cookie. Quote, "The biggest problem Lou Saban, who was his coach, ever had with anyone was with Cookie Gilchrist. He was so undisciplined that Lou couldn't handle him." In 1964, the Bills were playing the Patriots midway through the regular season. Cookie, who was frustrated with a lack of carries, took himself out of the game and refused to go back in. I think anyone who's been a star on a team understands this frustration. However, I do think that even Cookie would admit that he overreacted. Furious, head coach Lou Saban waived Cookie from the roster. As this New York Times article puts it, quote, "Gilchrist was suspended that night, but after apologizing at a team meeting, and after teammates asked Saban to give him another chance, Saban reluctantly reinstated him." Crazy enough, Cookie rejoined the team and went on to lead them to winning the championship game, a game in which he had over 100 yards, playing a significant role in the process. But he'd never play another game for the Bills, as the biggest moment of his career to that point would take place.
After the 1964 season, Cookie was playing for the Bills. They had just won the AFL championship. He was named to the All-Star team.
But after arriving in New Orleans for the All-Star game, Cookie, along with other black players, were treated disgracefully.
They wanted a professional football team. They had been unsuccessful up to that point, so they turned to the AFL. And they decided a way to court the AFL was to host this All-Star game. And they had assured all the athletes in the league that everybody would be treated equally and there would be no problems.
6 months after the Civil Rights Act was passed, in January 1965, an informal Jim Crow system ruled the Crescent City, and African American players talked amongst themselves about their inability to get cabs, be served in restaurants, or stay at certain hotels.
The derogatory remarks were yelled. They couldn't go down on Bourbon Street and go into some of the clubs. They had guns pulled on them. It was pretty much what you would not want to have happen. So the black players got together. Cookie was one of the leaders of this meeting, and they said, we're not going to take this. And they voted to boycott the game.
White players also announced that they would stand in support of their black teammates. Foss had no choice but to accede to their demands and moved the game to Houston. Amazingly, because of Gilchrist's leadership, not only did he lead a successful boycott of the AFL All-Star Game, but this was the catalyst to change in New Orleans.
The city of New Orleans had to take a good hard look at itself and say, you know what, we are not going to get a professional football team here unless we change our ways. And they did, and of course, a couple years later, they were awarded the New Orleans Saints, and a lot of people say these players really indirectly are linked to the New Orleans landing a franchise.
Following the boycott and the All-Star Game being moved, the Bills traded Cookie to Denver. He would last 3 more years in the league before retiring due to injuries. Now, Cookie's life as a player and as a person mostly go unknown, but what he accomplished was truly spectacular. Here's a list of some significant off-the-field events in his life. Number 1, as a junior in high school, Cookie was promised a roster spot in the NFL, only to be lied to and forced to Canada. Number 2, Cookie stood up for himself in Canada, winning a defamation settlement after being slandered by the newspapers in the 1950s. Number 3, he led a successful boycott of the AFL All-Star Game in 1965, which proceeded to help change things in New Orleans. Number 4, after Cookie's playing days, he resented the neglect that athletes experience when their careers are over. So he started a players' coalition that covered the 4 major sports in America. This aimed to help others transition from sports to another career. Number 5, other players would come to Cookie for advice to help them with negotiating their contracts. Number 6, Cookie also talked about how big of a deal concussions were and tried to influence changes at a time when nobody was talking about it. So it's important to note that Cookie struggled mightily later in life with what became known after his passing as CTE. It's deeply sad.
He was a pioneer in championing against concussions, brain damage, and CTE, and it's ironically sad that he, in his later years, suffered tremendously. And they determined that he had stage 4, which is the worst type of brain damage.
But it was something that he was fighting to change, and his vision for change on the concussion issue has made noticeable progress. Overall, Cookie played through 1967, which gave him 14 total pro seasons. This was pre-merger, which meant that he never played an actual snap in the NFL, despite being the only high schooler ever to be signed to the NFL. As good as a football player Cookie was, his off-the-field contributions had an even greater impact, which is pretty amazing, considering that he dominated on the field.
The greatest football player I've ever seen was Carlton Chester Gilchrist.